Today, we're going to dive into one of the most brutal and honestly one of the most important conflicts in all of history, the 30 Years' War. It was this sprawling, absolutely devastating catastrophe that totally reshaped Europe and, believe it or not, laid the foundation for the world we live in right now. So, yeah, let's get into it.
It all kicks off with a question that sounds like the setup to a really, really weird joke, right? How could throwing three guys out of a castle window possibly trigger a war that would go on for 3 decades and end up killing millions of people? Well, the answer is that it happened on a continent that was basically just waiting to explode.
So, that first spark was lit in Bohemia in an event with a fantastic name, the defenestration of Prague. Okay, so in 1618, you had these Protestant nobles who were furious with their Catholic rulers, the Habsburgs, because they felt their religious freedoms were being stripped away. So they took matters into their own hands. They marched up to Prague Castle, confronted 2 imperial officials and their secretary, and then they literally threw them out of a window. And here's the craziest part. They all survived the 70-foot fall. The Catholic story was that angels swooped down and saved them. The Protestant version? They landed in a giant, soft pile of horse manure. But, it doesn't really matter how they survived. The message had been sent loud and clear. This was open rebellion. The fuse was officially lit. Now, look, an event like that, as wild as it sounds, doesn't just start a 30-year war all on its own. It was really just the match being tossed into a huge continental tinderbox of religious and political tension that had been building up for years. At the heart of the problem was this principle from an earlier treaty called the Peace of Augsburg. The phrase was, cuius regio eius religio, which basically means whose realm, his religion. So a local prince got to decide if his territory was Catholic or Lutheran. But, and this is a huge but, it had a massive flaw. It didn't say anything about Calvinism, which was another huge Protestant faith that was spreading like wildfire. This little omission created all sorts of instability. So pretty quickly, these tensions started to harden. The Protestant princes, afraid of a Catholic takeover, formed a military alliance called the Protestant Union. And, well, what do you think happened next? The Catholic princes formed their own alliance, the Catholic League, a year later. Suddenly, Europe was split into 2 armed camps. Religious disagreements were now organized military blocs, just looking for a fight. So when the war finally did erupt, it wasn't just one long continuous conflict. It actually evolved over 30 years through 4 really distinct phases. And what's fascinating is how it started as a fight over religion, but it slowly morphed into a raw, brutal struggle for power on the continent. Okay, so let's walk through it. First, you have the Bohemian phase, where that initial revolt gets crushed. Then comes the Danish phase. Denmark jumps in to help the Protestants but gets defeated. It almost looked like the war was over. But then came the Swedish phase. The military genius King Gustavus Adolphus, known as the Lion of the North, shows up and just completely flips the script. And finally, you get the French phase, and this is where everything changes. This is the pivot point of the entire war. Get this. Catholic France, led by a cardinal of all people, Cardinal Richelieu, enters the war, but on the side of the Protestants. Why on earth would they do that? Well, Richelieu said it himself. This wasn't about God anymore. It was about weakening his Catholic rivals, the Habsburgs, who had France surrounded. This was pure power politics, or realpolitik, and it proved the war had moved way beyond faith. And that cynical political move prolonged the war for another decade. The cost was just staggering. We really need to pause for a second to grasp the sheer scale of the human catastrophe this war unleashed on Central Europe. It's almost unimaginable. In some of the German lands, it's estimated that 40% of the population was wiped out. 40%. Just let that sink in. In some places, it was even worse. We're talking about a demographic collapse on a scale that is just incredibly difficult to wrap your head around. And it was all driven by this perfect storm of destruction. So why was it so deadly? Well, for one, the war was fought by massive mercenary armies that just lived off the land. That means they plundered and destroyed everything in their path, which led to widespread famine. You also had incredibly brutal siege warfare. Cities like Magdeburg were sacked, and tens of thousands of civilians were massacred. And of course, wherever the armies went, disease followed. Plague, typhus, these things killed way more people than the actual fighting ever did.
So, after 3 decades of just relentless bloodshed, the exhausted powers of Europe finally came to the negotiating table. The result was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and this was a landmark treaty. It didn't just end a war, it really forged an entirely new world order. The treaty basically rewrote the rulebook for Europe. First off, Calvinism finally got its official recognition. Big deal. Next, the power of the Holy Roman Emperor was essentially broken, giving hundreds of smaller German states way more freedom to do their own thing. France came out of the whole mess as the new big dog on the continent. And, oh yeah, the independence of both the Dutch Republic and Switzerland was officially put on the books. But out of all these huge changes, one idea emerged that became the war's single most important legacy: the idea of state sovereignty. This is, and I mean this, the absolute bedrock of our modern international system. It's the simple idea that a country's borders are sacred, and what happens inside those borders is its own business, free from anybody else trying to meddle. So in the end, after millions were dead and a continent was just ravaged, the lesson was brutal, but it was crystal clear. The era of massive religious wars was over. From this point forward, it would be the cold, calculated interests of the state, not the passionate beliefs of faith, that would be the engine driving European politics. And really, that brings us right up to today. The Peace of Westphalia built the world of independent nations that we all live in. But now, in an age of globalization, huge international alliances, and problems that don't care about borders, you have to ask a pretty profound question. Nearly 400 years later, is that system actually built to last?